On December 12, 1944, Captain Robert Moore stood in the receiving lane of Camp McCain with a clipboard pinned to his coat and diesel exhaust washing over his boots. He had processed thousands of prisoners since arriving in Mississippi, and the work was meant to be mechanical. Instead, he kept replaying the paperwork he had read the night before. One War Department memo describing the post as surplus, another calling it non-active. And he felt the same conclusion tightening in his chest. If the camp was fading on paper, any exception would glow in an audit. The result was that he walked into the morning already afraid of ink. The cost was that fear makes a man cling to procedure even when procedure no longer fits the bodies in front of him. Colonel Edward Lewis arrived without speeches, inspected the guard line, and let routine do the talking for him. Moore liked that about Lewis because silence made fewer enemies. The result was a camp that looked disciplined whenever an outsider toured the wire. The cost was that discipline depended on the fiction that nothing unexpected could happen, and fiction breaks when the wrong truck arrives. The truck that rolled up carried a clean number on its transfer manifest, 43, and Moore let himself believe it would be another tidy intake. He signaled the corporal to drop the tailgate and lifted his pen to call the first name. The result was a procedure beginning as designed. The cost was that the procedure assumed bodies that could stand, speak, and wait. The tailgate fell with a metallic crack, and the first prisoner lowered herself down as if gravity could break her. She was a German woman in a field jacket that hung empty at the shoulders, cheekbones sharp, eyes too large in her skull. Moore's mind tried to file her under enemy soldier, and failed. The result was a pause in a place built on commands. The cost was that the pause invited everyone to stare, and stares turn into rumors. More figures shifted in the truck bed, and the mistake in Moore's expectation became unmistakable. 43 women climbed down, each moving like she had learned to ration motion. Moore saw loose bootlaces around thin ankles, bruises at wrists that suggested restraints, and rags wrapped where gloves should have been. A private behind him whispered, "My God, they're starving." And Moore turned, expecting Lewis to crush the comment as a discipline lapse. Lewis did not. His breath caught for half a second, then resumed, and his gloved hand tightened on the edge of Moore's clipboard hard enough to dent the backing. The result was that Moore understood the colonel was seeing something he had no template for. The cost was that once a commander loses his template, every decision becomes personal. Moore forced motion back into the lane because motion is what keeps panic from becoming a riot. He called for the receiving medic, tightened the guard spacing, and began assigning serial numbers, even while his eyes kept returning to throats and wrists, searching for what the manifest did not say. The result was that intake continued, and the camp kept its posture. The cost was that every number he wrote felt like a lie about the scale of the emergency, and lies stick to the man who writes them down. When Moore checked the transfer papers again, he noticed small fractures in the neatness. Several names were written in a different hand, and one page carried a signature line that looked freshly retraced, as if someone had wanted it to be darker. Moore could not prove anything, but he could imagine an investigator asking later why 43 women arrived in this condition and why the paperwork looked so clean. The result was suspicion without evidence. The cost was that suspicion made Moore start building a private list of questions he was not allowed to ask. Lewis issued a deviation in a voice that never rose, bypassed the outdoor holding pen, and moved the women directly to the warmest barracks. Moore obeyed, leading them through gravel paths and wire gates built for strong men, watching them stumble at steps the camp's design treated as trivial. He knew the standard layout by heart. Fenced sections subdivided into blocks, blocks into barracks and a mess hall, and he could feel that layout failing in real time. The result was that he got them indoors without drawing a crowd. The cost was that he had to bend the camp's internal logic to do it, and bent logic is what inspectors hunt. To make the move possible, Moore quietly displaced a dozen healthier prisoners from a barracks closest to the boilers, reassigning them to a colder block and marking the change on his chart with a small notation that looked harmless. The result was space and warmth for the women. The cost was resentment from displaced men and extra guard friction at the next roll call, because prisoners notice when the camp's logic changes and treat it as weakness. At the quartermaster shed, A clerk blinked at Moore's requisition slip and asked whether a non-active installation should be drawing extra heating fuel. Moore signed anyway because Lewis's authority was real even when it wasn't written in the right format. The result was that valves were turned and extra blankets moved. The cost was Moore's signature, his name, fixed in the paper trail as the man who requested the exception, and signatures are what auditors circle. Before dawn, Captain Walsh, the camp physician, handed Moore an initial assessment that read like a siren: extreme malnutrition, dehydration, high risk of collapse if handled like normal prisoners. Moore carried it to Lewis and watched the colonel read it twice, stare at the pine line outside the frosted window, and sit still for a long 10 seconds. The result was a decision made without witnesses. The cost was that the decision would belong to them alone when questions came, because no one else had been asked to sign for it. Lewis finally spoke. "Feed them first, register them after." Moore woke the mess crew, ordered hot porridge, bread and coffee, and told the cooks to serve measured portions, not the usual shove and curse rhythm reserved for enemies. The result was steam in the mess hall and women eating as if each swallow needed permission. The cost arrived 2 hours later when vomiting began. Cramps folded bodies over, and the infirmary hallway filled with the sour smell of a mistake that had been made with good intent and no protocol. Walsh confronted Moore in the corridor, angry enough to skip rank. The camp should have staged feeding, should have consulted protocols, should have treated this as a clinical crisis rather than a morale problem. Moore carried the confrontation to Lewis, and Lewis answered with the same stubborn calm: they needed food. The result was that the colonel chose outcomes over procedure and refused to sound uncertain. The cost was Walsh's diagnosis, refeeding syndrome, entered the medical file in ink, creating a clean label for what the camp had done wrong. Moore spent the day patching consequences: electrolyte broth, staggered meals, extra checks, while also writing an addendum that tried to make improvisation sound like controlled necessity. He wrote carefully, avoiding emotional words because emotional words looked like confession. The result was stabilization by evening and no deaths on his watch. The cost was a thicker stack of documents than any routine intake demanded, each page a future hook for someone who wanted to prove mismanagement. A week later, a typed letter arrived from the supply office asking for an explanation of unusual subsistence expenditures in the second week of December. Moore drafted a reply, and Lewis adjusted one phrase with a pencil until it read, "humanitarian exception," as if the words could stand between them and a budget officer with a ruler. The result was a sentence that sounded noble in a file folder. The cost was that nobility on official letterhead invites someone to ask who authorized it, and authorization questions rarely end at the first answer. Rumors hardened in the officers' quarters. Lewis was soft, the women were a trick. Pity was a security risk. Moore answered by tightening discipline elsewhere, sharper roll calls, stricter guard checks, hoping visible hardness would buy space for invisible mercy. The result was a camp that looked controlled again. The cost was a camp that felt meaner to everyone inside it, including the guards who had to enforce it, and meanness erodes judgment. When the women regained enough strength to stand at a counter, one of them approached Moore with English words spoken like heavy objects. "We work, kitchen." Moore took the request to Lewis and framed it as management, structured hours, food discipline, reduced idleness, while listing risks: contact, contraband, conversation. Lewis asked who would supervise, and Moore offered Sergeant Tucker, a mess sergeant known for strictness without theatre. The result was a plan that could be defended as order. The cost was that the plan created another document, another hinge point in the file. Lewis approved the kitchen detail with a short order: American supervision, fixed hours, weekly notes. The order did not explicitly ban conversation. Moore saw the omission and understood it was deliberate, a small valve left open so the women could function without being treated like machines. The result was that the kitchen became a corridor between captor and captive. The cost was that corridors are where boundaries fail, and failed boundaries become exhibits. Quick pause. If you want more true history, document-driven war stories like this one, hit like and follow so you don't miss the next episode. By early 1945, Moore spent more time with paper than with people because paper was what the army believed. He pulled labor rosters, ration ledgers and guard logs into neat piles, aligning dates and signatures the way a mechanic aligns gears. The result was a sense of control. If he could keep the documents straight, he could keep the camp straight. The cost was that documents remember everything and forgive nothing, and they never record the reasons a man hesitated. The labor program expanded as local farmers requested work details, because cotton did not wait for battles. Moore processed the requests and watched prisoners load into trucks under armed escort, hands in pockets, shoulders hunched against wind. Circulars from higher command treated prisoner labor as a managed resource. Hours, output, discipline. And Moore could see the bureaucracy's logic in the field trucks. The result was a camp that was no longer only a holding pen, it was a production node. The cost was that production turns prisoners into assets, and assets are fought over by bureaucracies that do not care who freezes in which barracks. The kitchen detail became part of that same logic. When Moore requested slightly richer rations for the women's recovery, a clerk in the supply shed asked about output before he asked about health. Moore began writing his justifications as if he were proving efficiency. Fewer sick calls, steadier work, lower incident risk. The result was that mercy gained a bureaucratic disguise. The cost was that the disguise trained Moore to speak about human bodies as columns in a ledger, and ledger language reshapes what a man thinks is acceptable. Lieutenant Hargrove, the intelligence officer, brought Moore another kind of pressure in daily briefs. He spoke of ideological factions in prisoner compounds, of hardline men enforcing loyalty inside the wire, and of the Army's interest in political screening to reduce intimidation and violence. He also reminded Moore that communications were not neutral. Prisoner letters were reviewed, meetings were monitored, and even German-language camp newspapers, typed, mimeographed, passed hand to hand, were tolerated only under scrutiny. The result was that Moore began to see normal camp life as a web of channels. The cost was that once life becomes channels, every corridor is a potential offense. Hargrove once placed a confiscated sheet on Moore's desk, a German camp paper from another facility, and tapped the margins where the censor's pencil marks cut through sentences. He told Moore it only took one unexamined channel for an inspector to write the word lax. The result was that Moore began to see the kitchen not as a room, but as a channel. The cost was that channels are measured, and measuring a room changes what happens inside it. Moore tried to control the risk by expanding observation. He asked Tucker for short notes about the kitchen, not transcripts, just themes, arguments, unusual requests, any sign of coordination. Tucker complied in the blunt language of a sergeant who hated paperwork but hated disorder more. The result was a new stream of reporting that made Moore feel protected. The cost was that the act of monitoring transformed ordinary speech into potential misconduct, and misconduct files expand faster than any other kind. One afternoon, a guard reported a folded paper exchanged near the kitchen door and accused Tucker of getting friendly. Moore investigated and found a recipe in German for bread that used less yeast and more thyme, something Tucker had asked for because supplies were tight and the women knew how to stretch flour. The result was embarrassment, because the threat was domestic and trivial. The cost was that embarrassment did not erase the incident from the log, and logs are what inspectors read when they want patterns. Moore disciplined the guard anyway for making accusations without evidence, because he needed to show the chain of command was intact. The result was a visible assertion of order. The cost was that the guard took the rebuke personally and carried it into barracks talk, feeding the rumor that Moore and Lewis were protecting prisoners from scrutiny, and rumors are fuel. Moore issued a directive. No personal exchanges between guards and prisoners, even harmless ones, without a supervisor present. The result was a stiffening of boundaries that looked professional. The cost was that stiff boundaries make resentment accumulate, and resentment seeks outlets in the exact places Moore was trying to keep calm. When news of Germany's surrender reached the camp in May through a guardhouse radio, Moore watched prisoners react in contradictory ways. Some cheered quietly, some stared at the ground, some looked terrified. The result was that enemy suddenly felt too simple to describe them. The cost was that policy demanded simplicity precisely when reality became complicated, and complicated reality pushes people to ask for exceptions. In the months that followed, Moore received post-war circulars emphasizing repatriation, processing and control of communications. He saw how quickly the bureaucracy tightened rules around letters, gatherings, and anything that could be called organizing. The result was a new kind of tension, hope inside the wire, caution outside it. The cost was that the camp's most dangerous material became not weapons but expectations, and expectations do not fit neatly in a ledger. Lewis survived the winter exception without immediate punishment, but he grew quieter. He walked the perimeter more, checked towers himself, and spent longer at his desk with the lamp on. The result was a commander who looked diligent. The cost was that diligence, to a bureaucracy looking for a culprit, can look like preparation, and preparation looks like concealment. In December 1945, Lewis approved a Christmas meal as a controlled morale event, justified in writing as a stability measure in a volatile post-war period. Moore arranged donations, secured paper decorations, and tightened guard rotations so the event would not appear lax. The result was a mess hall transformed with tinsel and a pine tree that smelled like sap. The cost was that transformation created expectations the camp could not satisfy, because no holiday can solve a future. After plates were cleared, a woman named Ice, Moore had checked her file often enough to recognize the signature, stood and spoke in English that sounded rehearsed. She said some of them did not want to go back, because Germany was broken and the future there looked like rubble. Lewis did not answer. He nodded once and sat down as if the motion ended the matter. The result was a statement that turned a holiday into a petition without becoming a riot. The cost was that the statement now existed in witnesses who could repeat it in the wrong room. In January 1946, a petition appeared on Moore's desk with 18 signatures beneath a careful English request asking for consideration to remain in the United States. Moore read it twice, checked names against intake lists, and felt his stomach tighten, because the paper was orderly enough to demand formal handling. The result was a legal object inside a camp built to avoid legal nuance. The cost was that formal handling meant escalation to offices that hated improvisation and loved precedence. Moore brought the petition to Lewis, and Lewis ordered an attachment: evaluation of behavior, work records, medical history, incidents. Moore assembled it like a prosecutor building a case. Guard logs showing no escapes, labor rosters showing steady performance, infirmary records showing recovery, Tucker's notes showing no plotting. The result was a packet portraying the women as manageable and non-threatening. The cost was that the packet also proved how closely the camp had monitored them, and monitoring can be reframed as favoritism. Washington's reply did not reject the petition outright. It requested a detailed assessment and asked for clarification of the camp's December 1944 subsistence deviation. The result was a bureaucratic opening that looked like interest. The cost was that the opening confirmed scrutiny. The petition had pulled the camp into a spotlight that searched for mistakes as eagerly as it searched for solutions. Lewis dictated the general shape of the assessment, and Moore wrote it into pages that balanced on a thin line. He described the women as not ideologues and not organizers, but people who had arrived in extreme deprivation and stabilized under structured supervision. The result was a report that tried to frame compassion as prudence. The cost was that the report bundled every earlier deviation into a single, reviewable narrative, and narratives are what inspectors use to prove intent. In March 1946, Inspector Caldwell arrived with authorization letters and a face that suggested he had already decided what he would find. He requested the December intake file, Walsh's medical reports, subsistence ledgers showing the spike, the kitchen detail authorization, and the petition packet. The result was that the camp's past sat on a table like a body awaiting autopsy. The cost was that Moore could no longer pretend exceptions were isolated. Caldwell read them as a pattern in search of a motive. The interview lasted 3 hours in headquarters, chairs scraping and a recorder clicking softly as it captured each answer. Caldwell questioned Lewis with repetitive precision. Had he expanded prisoner treatment without precedent, created reliance, permitted undue interaction, allowed sentiment to override military necessity? Moore was questioned next, and Caldwell focused on the clerical heart of the matter. Who wrote the letters? Who signed requisitions? Who recorded exceptions? Moore answered in short sentences, careful to match documents and careful not to defend a man in ways paper could not support. The result was testimony that protected the file's coherence. The cost was that coherence required Moore to let Lewis stand alone as the visible decision-maker. Caldwell produced a comparison chart, subsistence expenditures against labor output, and suggested the camp had let emotion distort allocation. Lewis defended outcomes. No deaths, no escapes, order maintained. The result was a clash between numbers and faces. The cost was that numbers speak the institution's native language and faces become anecdotes. 4 weeks after Caldwell left, orders arrived reassigning Lewis to a warehouse post in Louisiana, a job that kept rank while stripping authority. The result was a punishment that refused to call itself punishment. The cost was that everyone understood anyway, and understanding has its own cruelty. It cannot be appealed because it is never written down. Lewis submitted early retirement within days. Moore processed the papers and escorted him to the gate, listening to pine wind move through wire as a labor truck idled nearby, ready to carry prisoners to field details like nothing had happened. Near the kitchen door, Martha stood rigid with her hands clasped and spoke one sentence. "Thank you, Colonel." Lewis nodded without stopping because stopping would have turned gratitude into a scene. The result was a farewell smaller than a breath. The cost was that Moore understood, finally, what the half-second pause at the tailgate had been. Not surprise, but the first sign of an ending. Moore stayed in uniform after Lewis left, because survival is a kind of obedience. He transferred, promoted quietly, and trained himself to refer to Camp McCain as a challenging assignment rather than a turning point. The result was a career that continued. The cost was a private silence that grew heavier each year, because silence is something a man carries, and it thickens with time. He kept copies of certain papers in a separate envelope despite regulations, enough to reconstruct the chain if questions ever returned. The result was a private archive under his desk glass. The cost was that keeping evidence made him feel unclean, as if he had learned the colonel's habit of breaking rules for a reason he could not confess aloud. In 1970, a manila envelope arrived at Moore's Virginia home with a letter addressed in careful handwriting. The return name was Martha Schaefer, Atlanta, Georgia. Moore held it for a full minute before opening it. Because the weight felt disproportionate to the paper, the result was hesitation that resembled Lewis's half-second breath, repeated in another body. The cost was that Moore knew the letter would resurrect everything he had spent decades compressing into silence. Martha's letter was short. She wrote that she was alive, that her children were grown, that she had become an American citizen years earlier, and that she wanted to thank Colonel Lewis for a decision made on a winter morning when she stepped off a truck not knowing if she would survive. The result was a simple statement of continuity that made the original exception feel justified. The cost was an implied question Moore could not answer. If it mattered that she lived, why did it end the man who made it possible? Moore sat at his desk that night and pulled a sheet of stationery from a drawer, the kind stamped with his return address in the corner. He began a reply to Martha in a voice that sounded too official, then crossed out the first line and tried again in a voice that sounded too intimate. After an hour, he had written nothing that felt safe, because any explanation would either defend Lewis in ways the files could not prove or reduce Martha's life to a bureaucratic case. The result was a page covered in false starts, proof that even in retirement he still wrote as if someone were watching. The cost was that he tore the page into small pieces and threw them away, choosing silence again, even while it tasted like betrayal. Enclosed was a copy of Lewis's unsent reply draft found among his effects. In one sentence, Lewis wrote, "You are the only violation I do not regret." The result was a confession condensed into a line that left no room for reinterpretation. The cost was that the word violation turned the story back into what the institution had always insisted it was, a breach, not a virtue. Moore read the sentence, and then, out of habit, pulled his own saved copies and aligned dates, signatures, and thin points where the chain had flexed. A conflicting status memo, a clean number on a manifest, a subsistence spike, a diagnosis in ink, an authorization with an omission, a petition with 18 names, an interview recorded for 3 hours, an order of reassignment in a sealed envelope. The result was a history that could be reconstructed without anyone raising a voice. The cost was that reconstruction also proved something Moore had avoided admitting. The system had not punished failure. It had punished disobedient compassion. Moore did not write Martha back. He told himself the letter was not his to answer, and he feared that adding his voice would turn a private mercy into a public exhibit. The result was restraint. The cost was that restraint felt like repeating the old act of letting silence do the work, the same act that had protected him and abandoned Lewis. In the mid-1990s, Moore returned to Mississippi once, old enough to believe time had lowered the risk. He visited the former campgrounds and found a modest memorial narrative about training, national effort, and prisoners behind wire. There were no names from his file, no mention of refeeding, petitions, or early retirement. The result was a clean public memory suitable for ceremonies. The cost was that cleanliness erased the human price, including the absence of a colonel's name. Before leaving Mississippi, Moore returned to his motel and slid the envelope of copies back under the glass on his portable writing case. He could have mailed the packet to a historian, could have forced the institution to acknowledge the chain, but he chose custody over exposure because he had watched exposure destroy Lewis in slow motion. The result was that the story remained intact but private, carried forward by one man's careful hoarding of paper. The cost was that privacy delayed recognition for decades, and delay is its own kind of verdict when the people who lived the events are already disappearing. Moore stood near where he believed the receiving lane had been and listened to wind move through pine needles and wire the way it had in 1944. The result was quiet that sounded like nothing at all. The cost was invisible because the true payment for that half-second breath had been made in paperwork, in career endings, and in a story preserved only because one man never threw an envelope away.